good to be talking about this.
Yeah, today we're digging into the foundations of just a truly remarkable figure, John von Neumann, often called, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century.
Absolutely. And we're using the sources we have to sort of trace his path, right? From Budapest, his childhood,
Exactly.
through that early work in Europe, and then, crucially, that move over to the United States.
Right. Our mission really is to get a feel for the roots of that genius. How did those early years kind of set the stage for everything that came later? Discovering the origins of the legend, you could say.
And it really is crucial, that early period. You can't understand the later von Neumann without it.
So let's start right at the beginning then. Born December 28, 1903, Budapest, Hungary.
Right. And he grew up, eldest of three sons, in a family described as having, well, material comfort.
Material comfort. His father, Max von Neumann, was a successful banker.
Yeah, a partner in a private banking firm there in Budapest. And apparently, according to von Neumann himself, his father was actually quite influential.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, he said it was his father who really pushed him or encouraged him, let's say, towards a career in science.
Interesting. And the signs of that genius, they showed up early, didn't they?
Incredibly early. A pronounced interest in mathematics, get this, from the age of 13.
13.
It wasn't just numbers. He was also, throughout his life, just a huge reader of history. Voracious, apparently.
Yeah, the sources highlight that, don't they? His memory.
Yeah.
Most remarkable retentive memory for both science and history. That ability to just soak it all up and keep it.
Yeah, seems fundamental to who he was. And it wasn't just potential. I mean, it bore fruit incredibly quickly. Think about this.
Go on.
He was already a co-author on a published mathematical paper at 18.
18, before university.
Exactly, before he even formally started his college studies. An 18-year-old contributing to published research is kind of mind-blowing.
That's more than just bright. That's operating at a different level already. Okay, so remarkable start in Budapest. Where did he go for his education then across Europe?
Well, he really covered some ground. First stop was the University of Berlin. Spent 2 years there, 1921 to 23.
Okay.
And interestingly, he wasn't just focused on math. He took chemistry courses there, too.
Chemistry, huh? Seems a bit of a detour maybe.
You might think so, but it shows the breadth of his mind, I think. And actually, Fritz Haber, who was a big name in chemistry in Berlin then.
Right, Haber process.
That's the one. He apparently met von Neumann and saw real potential there, like for a chemistry career.
No kidding. Wow.
Yeah.
The path is not taken. So from Berlin, where did he head next?
Next was Switzerland, the Institute of Technology in Zurich. He finished up there in 1925 and got an engineering degree, also in chemistry.
So he's still pursuing chemistry, gets an engineering degree in it. Was math still happening on the side?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't on the side, really. At the same time he's doing this chemistry engineering degree, he's also publishing very good mathematical papers.
What kind of math was he focused on then?
Primarily axiomatic set theory.
Okay, set theory. For listeners maybe not familiar, what's the gist?
Well, very basically, it's about the absolute foundations of mathematics, like the fundamental building blocks, the rules, making sure everything is logically rigorous. It was a huge area back then.
Got it. So grappling with the bedrock of math itself.
Precisely. While getting a degree in chemical engineering.
In a different country.
Right. And then in 1926, he's still only 23, he gets his doctorate from the University of Budapest back home.
For the set theory work.
Exactly. For his thesis on axiomatic set theory.
An engineering degree in Zurich, a math PhD in Budapest, all by 23. That's quite something.
It really is. And that doctorate immediately paid off, got him a position back at the University of Berlin. A private doesn't.
Private doesn't. That's the German system thing, right?
Yeah.
Lecturing, but no actual salary initially.
Exactly. Sort of a stepping stone, unpaid, but you get to teach and establish yourself.
And did he connect with people there, important mathematicians?
Yeah, definitely. Erhard Schmidt, who was a senior figure there, big in analysis, but also interested in set theory, he apparently really took to von Neumann, befriended him.
Okay, so he's making his mark in the math world, especially set theory. But his interests kept shifting, didn't they?
They really did. Pretty soon, his focus moved again, this time towards quantum theory. which was, very new and exciting then.
Right, the physics revolution happening.
Exactly. So he dives into theoretical physics, starts thinking about the mathematical framework needed, learning the physics, developing the tools.
That leap from pure math foundations to the sort of messy edge of physics.
It's characteristic, I think. And he published some major papers on quantum theory in the late 1920s.
Okay.
And then almost like he just squeezed it in.
Yeah.
Between papers on logic and quantum physics, in 1928 comes his first paper on the theory of games.
Game theory, wow. Which, became so huge later on in economics, computing, everywhere.
Absolutely foundational. This 1928 paper, that's where he proved the minimax theorem.
Minimax. For two-person zero-sum games.
It's a one.
Can you give us the nutshell version of what that means?
Sure. Simply put, it shows that in a game where it's pure competition, one person wins exactly what the other loses. There's always a rational strategy you can play that guarantees you minimize your maximum possible loss. Assuming your opponent is rational too, of course.
Right. Sort of finding the safest worst-case outcome.
Kind of, yeah. It was a massive step in thinking about strategy mathematically.
Okay, so let's recap. Before he's even 30, he's made fundamental contributions to set theory, to the mathematical structure of quantum mechanics, and he's basically kicked off modern game theory.
It's an absolutely staggering range, isn't it, for someone so young?
Truly. So after Berlin, did he stay put for a while?
Not for long. He had one more short stint in Germany. In 1929, he moved to the University of Hamburg, again as a private dozen, but only stayed there a year.
Just 1 year. And that brings us then to the big move, crossing the Atlantic.
Exactly. He first came over to the United States in 1930. He was 27.
And his family came too.
Yeah, sources say his brothers and his mother, who was widowed by then, they also made the move to the U.S.
And you have to think about the timing here. 1930, Europe, Germany. Things were starting to get unstable.
Definitely. The sources don't explicitly say, he fled because of X, but they do later frame his work during the war in the context of fighting Nazi fascism and the fear of weapons falling into their hands. Moving from Germany in 1930, well, the timing is certainly suggestive looking back.
Right. So he lands in the U.S. in 1930. Where does he set up shop academically?
Princeton, New Jersey. That became his academic home, really, for the rest of his life.
Okay.
Initially, from 1930 to 33, he was a visiting professor at Princeton University itself.
And then came the big one, the Institute for Advanced Study.
Yes. In 1933, he became one of the original permanent members. Einstein was there, Gödel. It was this incredible gathering of minds. And he held that post at the IAS for the rest of his career.
Must have been quite the environment. Was he already well known in the U.S. math community by then?
Oh, yeah. He became widely known pretty quickly. Initially, maybe more among the senior established mathematicians.
Right.
But then after he published a paper on something called almost periodic functions.
Okay, what's that about?
It's a type of function important in things like signal analysis, Fourier analysis. Kind of technical. But the point is that paper apparently got him recognition among the sort of rank and file mathematicians too, broadened his reputation.
So by the early 1930s, he's not just in America, he's a central figure in American mathematics, already recognized for this incredible string of achievements from his European years.
That's a great way to put it. He didn't arrive as an unknown quantity. He arrived as a force, having already reshaped parts of mathematics and physics. Set theory, quantum mechanics, game theory. Already on his resume.
And it really does feel like this whole early journey, the gifted childhood in Budapest, the intense, broad studies across Europe, the knack for seeing mathematical structure everywhere, and then arriving in the U.S. just as the world stage was shifting so dramatically. It all seems to perfectly position him, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's like his intellect and the historical moment converged, positioned him for a different kind of impact, maybe one with more immediate world-altering consequences.
Which is exactly where we're heading next time. We'll continue this deep dive and look at that next huge chapter, his involvement in the Manhattan Project.
Right, Los Alamos, World War II, the atomic bomb, and also his work on early computing, using machines like E&I Hay for those incredibly complex calculations.
It really sets up a fascinating question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How does this mind, so adept at abstract mathematics, logic, foundational questions?
Yeah, how does that mind transition to working on something so practical, so urgent, and frankly, so terrifyingly consequential as the atomic bomb?
That transition, that story. It was this period of intense debate, huge pressures, and, well, a constantly shifting idea of what responsibility even meant.
And not just individuals, right? The institutions, too.
Oh, absolutely. Universities, scientific societies,
Hmm.
they were all caught up in it, changed by it.
Right. So let's dive into this stack, see what nuggets we can find for you.
Where to start?
Gotta be the beginning, right? The Manhattan Project.
Makes sense.
What jumps out from these sources is just that sheer urgency. World War II, the drive to build the bomb.
Yeah, the material is really clear on that initial motivation and the war. That was the stated goal.
But interestingly, one source points to maybe another layer.
Right. It mentions this idea,
Yeah.
perhaps a desire to show the Soviets who would be the big dog following the war.
So right from the start, you've got this mix.
Yeah. And in the conflict, definitely. But also geopolitics kicking in immediately.
And then the bombs are used and boom, the ethical shockwave.
Instantaneous.
Yeah.
The sources really capture that. You have Bertrand Russell and Einstein.
Their manifesto, yeah. Warning the world. What was the line? Everything had changed.
Powerful stuff. It just hangs there, doesn't it? The scale of it.
But what's also fascinating, and the sources highlight this, is hearing from scientists who are inside the project.
Like Viktor Weisskopf. He's quoted looking back.
What did he say?
That they got so deeply into solving the technical problems that the thought of quitting, he said, did not even cross my mind back then.
Wow. That shows how consuming the intellectual puzzle could be.
Yeah, it could sort of overshadow the massive implications, at least for a moment.
That's a key insight. Though we should mention, the sources do point out an important exception.
Joseph Rotblat.
Exactly. He objected on ethical grounds, left the project before the bombs were even finished.
And went on to found the Pugwash Arms Control Movement. Nobel Peace Prize winner later on.
A powerful counterexample, definitely there in the material.
And this whole situation brings up that debate, which is also in the sources, about what is theoretical research itself inherently moral or immoral?
Right, like Stanislaw Ulam's view.
Yeah, he's quoted saying it's not immoral to try to calculate physical phenomena.
His argument being
That even, pure math can have terrible consequences down the line, but that potential misuse shouldn't stop the basic science. It's a complex argument they present.
So, looking back at this early period through these sources, why does it matter so much for understanding what came next?
Well, it fundamentally set the stage, didn't it?
Yeah.
Created that really complex, often strained relationship, science, government, ethics, all tangled.
And it shows how fast urgent goals can kind of push aside those deeper ethical questions in the heat of the moment.
Definitely a pattern we see again.
Okay, so let's move past that initial shock into the post-war era. The arms race kicks into high gear.
And a big flashpoint you see in the sources, nuclear testing.
Right. Concerns about radioactive fallout really start bubbling up.
Yeah, and publications like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists become really important voices raising the alarm.
Scientists get involved in pushing for a test ban.
They do, very active. But again, the sources show it wasn't a united front.
Different views within the community.
Absolutely. Some argued, like L.W. Nordheim is quoted, that the dangers of war were so much greater.
But the hazards of testing seemed small in comparison.
Exactly. That testing was necessary for deterrence. So, yeah, an internal debate.
And this is where we see scientists moving into more formal roles, advisors within government.
Prime example, the President's Science Advisory Committee, PSAC.
Under Eisenhower and Kennedy, right. The sources detail their work.
Yeah, brought in to evaluate the technical side of national security.
What's really interesting there is the internal stuff, the dynamics within those groups.
Oh yeah, the sources describe some real tension.
Between who?
Well, you had advisors pushing for arms control names like Wisner, Herbert York come up, and they often clashed with those more aligned with, let's say, military expansion.
Like Edward Teller, father of the H-bomb.
He's mentioned, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely described as being on the more hawkish end in these sources.
You can feel the frustration in some of the quotes the sources pull out. Herbert York, for instance.
What did he say?
He basically said the whole situation, more weapons, actually meaning less security, has no technical solution.
Wow. From an insider.
Yeah. He thought the only real answer was political. Arms control negotiations. Peacefully done.
That's powerful. And it shows how the technical arguments themselves became weapons in the debate.
How so?
Well, the sources mentioned specific panels, like the Fisk panel, the Panofsky panel.
Okay.
They were tasked with evaluating technical questions, like, is it better to refine warheads or just build more? How well can we detect Soviet tests?
And those findings were used
To support arguments both for and against, things like a test ban, marshaled for policy battles.
So what was the outcome of all this wrangling during that period?
Well, the sources point to the partial test ban treaty being negotiated.
Partial meaning.
Ban tests everywhere except underground.
Ah, so it addressed the fallout concern, which is a big ethical issue.
Right. But as the material notes, it wasn't the comprehensive ban many scientists really wanted. Still, a step.
And scientists were key in testifying for it.
Yes, instrumental in getting even that partial ban passed.
So this phase, digging into these sources, it really shows scientists trying to influence policy from the inside, using their expertise.
Definitely. But it also starkly shows the limits, right?
Yeah. When technical advice runs up against political priorities or military momentum.
Exactly. A tough reality.
But the Cold War wasn't just nukes. We shift gears to Vietnam.
And the ethical questions change shape again. Now it's about chemical agents, other technologies.
Like napalm, the sources cover its development and use.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The material mentions Louis Pfizer, the chemist involved.
His view is complex.
Apparently, yeah. Opposed using it against babies and Buddhists, as the quote goes, but didn't see the tech itself as inherently immoral. Made a distinction with poison gas.
Tear gas is also mentioned.
Right, another tool used.
Right.
But the really big one, ethically speaking,
Agent Orange.
Agent Orange. Defoliants. The sources trace its origins, its escalating use.
And this is where basic science gets tangled up again.
Absolutely. Arthur Galston's story is highlighted, his early work on plant hormones.
Became relevant to making defoliants.
Yeah. And he grew deeply concerned, along with others, about the effects, ecological damage, potential health impacts.
The dioxin contamination issue.
Exactly. That's detailed in the source of the Bionetic study. The huge controversy that followed. It became a major ethical battleground.
Then there was another group of scientists advising during Vietnam, the Jasons.
Right, another elite group. The sources discussed their work, evaluating bombing effectiveness.
And proposing that electronic barrier idea, right? Across the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Yeah, it's the one. But what's really telling about the Jasons, based on this material,
What's that?
their own skepticism about the bombing campaigns. Their analysis found no measurable effect on North Vietnam's ability to keep fighting in the South.
Wow. That's quite an indictment of the strategy from the inside.
It really speaks volumes and highlights how hard, maybe impossible it was to calculate outcomes in that kind of war.
Did they weigh in on using tactical nukes in Vietnam?
They did. The sources quote their report. It warned the political effects would be uniformly bad and could be catastrophic.
Pretty blunt warning.
Very. And this whole Vietnam period seems to have really disillusioned some of the scientists involved in advising.
You mean working within the system wasn't working?
Or became ethically untenable for some. The sources mentioned George Kistiakowsky fearing his work on the barrier was futile. And they note a wave of resignations among the Jasons. It suggests that proximity to the realities of that war was deeply unsettling for many.
So taking stock of this part of the story, why is it important for you listening to this deep dive?
Well, it shows the ethical debates broadening out
Right.
beyond just nuclear weapons.
To conventional warfare, chemical agents,
Yeah.
other tech.
Yeah. And scientists having to confront their role in all of it.
Yeah.
It really underscores that tension between technical solutions and the messy, often brutal reality of conflict.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. Back home, in a way. Because universities became battlegrounds, too.
Right? The sources detail this huge increase in defense funding pouring into places like MIT, Princeton.
They became what? Non-industrial defense contractors?
That's the phrase used in one source, yeah.
Yeah.
Quite striking. And the justifications often involved serving the nation, giving researchers access to cutting-edge tech.
Arguments we heard earlier from figures like Compton.
Exactly. But this didn't sit well with everyone, especially later on.
The late 60s, protests.
Big time. The sources highlight movements challenging the ethics of doing war-related classified research right there on campus.
So the focus shifted, not just individual scientists, but the institutions themselves.
Precisely. The sources give specific examples, like the Palance Panel Review at MIT. Intense debates about labs closely tied to the university, like the Instrumentation Lab, Lincoln Lab.
And you saw very different viewpoints clash.
Oh, yeah. Defenses of the work Charles Broxmeyer's mentioned, and sharp critiques calling for major changes, people like Noam Chomsky, Jonathan Cabat.
What were the core questions being asked on campus, according to these sources?
Really profound ones, like, was military money distorting the university's mission? What was the ethical responsibility of the university as an institution?
Should war research even be on campus? Classified stuff.
Right. Should there be outright bans? It highlights this real struggle. Where does responsibility lie? With the individual scientist's conscience.
Or does the university itself have a collective duty?
Exactly. And the sources point to this tension, trying to achieve institutional neutrality, which Princeton's Kuhn Committee discussed.
But the reality is funding shapes research, doesn't it?
Undeniably, that comes through loud and clear.
And these campus debates, they weren't isolated, were they?
Not at all. They reflected this broader societal reckoning with science and technology's role in the Cold War.
And they raise questions that feel, well, still incredibly relevant today about who sets the research agenda, where the money comes from, and the ethics of it all.
Definitely.
Looking quickly ahead, the material touches on what came after Vietnam, Nixon dismantling PSAC.
Yeah, a big shift there.
And then the debates around Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or Star Wars.
Right. And SDI sparked another wave of activism from scientists, often more unified, perhaps, than during Vietnam.
So this later history just reinforces that core tension we keep seeing.
I think so, yeah. The sources really hammer home that dual role, the scientist as knowledge seeker and contributor to applications.
Including potentially devastating ones.
Right. And that ongoing debate, is it better to work inside the system to change it or outside?
That question never really goes away, does it?
Seems not. And you see the impact on the big scientific societies, too. APS, AAAS, mentioned in the sources.
So?
Their own struggle. Moving from strict neutrality sometimes towards actually taking public stances on policy, like with SDI. It was a slow, contested evolution for them.
So the big picture from these sources.
It's messy, complex debates, no easy answers, scientists making tough choices under huge pressure, often with incomplete information.
And very different ideas about duty and responsibility? Okay, so let's zoom back out. We've gone deep into these sources, explored this really intense time where science, war, and geopolitics just collided.
Dramatically.
We've seen scientists wrestling with the outcomes of their work, debating ethics, trying to influence policy.
Sometimes succeeding, sometimes not so much.
And what really stands out from the sources is that this wasn't one unified scientific community view.
Far from it. Deeply held, often conflicting beliefs, but what was the right thing to do?
From continuing research for deterrence.
To pushing hard for disarmament or protesting those military ties at universities. A whole spectrum.
It just leaves you thinking about that constant tension, doesn't it? The pure pursuit of knowledge.
Versus the pressures of funding, national security.
And the huge moral weight when that knowledge gets applied.
And there's this other thread, too, about technology itself that the sources touch on. They mention, for instance, developing sophisticated techniques for, information processing, pattern recognition.
For things like that electronic barrier in Vietnam. Right.
Developed for military applications.
Which really makes you wonder, doesn't it? As science and tech keep accelerating, especially now with AI, complex data analysis, automation, all central to defense and intelligence.
Yeah.
How do we make sure that drive for innovation is always guided by a really careful, deeply considered sense of ethics, of societal impact?
That is the question, isn't it? A crucial one to keep asking.
His groundbreaking theoretical work from decades ago laid the groundwork for concepts we now see everywhere in computing and AI.
It really is remarkable how many of these ideas, which seemed, so abstract at the time, actually anticipated the very evolution of computing and artificial intelligence as we know it.
Right.
He wasn't just thinking about the machines of his time, but really the potential for computation and complexity far into the future.
Exactly. So we're going to try and pull the key insights from these sources on three major threads of his work. There's his theories on self-replicating machines, the whole concept of cellular automata, and his surprisingly early ideas related to neural networks and, machine learning.
Yeah, the neural network stuff is fascinatingly early.
Totally. We want to understand how these concepts sort of became blueprints, influencing everything from digital evolution to modern AI approaches and, of course, the fundamental architecture of computers.
And you'll see throughout this deep dive, von Neumann's genius wasn't just confined to one box. I mean, his vision was incredibly broad, very interdisciplinary.
Pulling from math, physics,
biology, logic.
Yeah.
And influencing fields far beyond just computation itself. It's quite something.
So let's jump right into that first big concept from the sources. The idea of self-replicating machines. I mean, it sounds like science fiction, right? But von Neumann was exploring the theory behind it way back in the early 1940s.
He was. That's where he proposed the concept of a universal constructor.
Universal constructor.
Yeah, think of it as a theoretical machine capable of building an exact copy of itself. His work basically demonstrated that based on the principles of automata theory, such a thing was, well, theoretically possible.
And the importance wasn't just about making duplicates, was it? It was more than that.
Oh, definitely more. No, the significance was profound. This theoretical framework showed that you could create machines that weren't just static tools.
Yeah.
They could replicate and perform complex computations as part of that whole replication process. It fundamentally linked the ideas of reproduction and computation.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, connects to a more maybe visual framework. Cellular automata, or CA.
Right.
This was a key way von Neumann modeled complex systems and also kind of built his self-replicating machine theory. Can you break down what a CA is based on what we've got here?
Absolutely. So imagine a grid of cells.
Yeah.
Like squares on a checkerboard, though, it could be one-dimensional or, higher dimensions too.
Okay.
Each of these cells is simple. It can only exist in one of a finite number of possible states at any given moment. Maybe just on or off, like black or white.
Or maybe more possibilities?
Exactly. Or maybe many more possible states.
And how does this grid system, change over time?
Well, that's the core of it. The state of each cell in the grid changes from one moment or one tick to the next, based on a set of really simple rules.
Simple rule.
Yeah, these rules just look at the cell's current state and the states of its immediate neighbors, the cells right next to it. Time progresses in these discrete steps, essentially evolving the grid from one generation to the next based purely on these local interactions.
And von Neumann developed the very first self-replicating CA, according to the sources here.
He did, yeah. His original model was actually quite involved for its time. It used a two-dimensional square grid
Okay.
and comprised thousands of these elementary cells.
Thousands, wow. And each cell could have up to 29 possible states? That sounds much more complex than a simple on-off.
Oh, much more complex, that's right. And the rules governing how a cell's state changed depended on its own state and the states of its four closest neighbors, north, east, south, west.
Got it.
The source also notes it had the property of universal. The description kind of cuts off there.
Yeah.
But it suggests it was designed to be capable of universal computation or construction, sort of mirroring the power of a universal Turing machine, but within this grid system.
Okay, so to help us visualize how these simple rules can lead to complex behavior in CAs, the sources bring in other examples. A really well-known one is Conway's Game of Life.
Oh yeah, that's a perfect illustration. That's another two-dimensional CA, but much simpler in terms of states. Cells are either just dead or alive. That's it.
Right.
Yet, despite these incredibly simple rules governing birth, survival, death, all based on the neighbor count, you see surprisingly dynamic and, complex patterns emerge.
Like the stable block pattern that just sits there unchanging, right? Or the oscillating blinker that flips back and forth.
Exactly. The blinker just goes back and forth every step. Simple local rules leading to this fascinating global behavior.
Yeah.
And you see this variety even more starkly in one-dimensional CAs, like those Wolfram rules that are mentioned.
Ah, the Wolfram rules.
Yeah, so rules like 254 produce these uniform patterns. Rule 250 gives you a simple checkerboard, pretty straightforward.
Okay.
But then Rule 90 creates these really intricate nested triangular patterns like Sierpinski triangles. And Rule 30 generates patterns of very high complexity that look almost random.
Huh. Almost random, but they're not.
They're not. They're generated by a completely deterministic rule. It's just incredibly complex output from a simple input.
That really connects to that quote from Richard Feynman included in the sources, doesn't it? Where he mused about physics laws being simple, like a checkerboard.
Right.
And all the apparent complexity of the universe just arising from those simple underlying rules. It feels like a perfect analogy for CAs.
It really does. And Christopher Langton's insight, also from the sources, captures that dynamic aspect of how complex systems like CAs evolve. He said, local behavior supports global dynamics, shapes local context, which affects local behavior, which supports global dynamics, and so forth.
That feedback loop.
Exactly. It's this continuous feedback loop between the simple local actions and the resulting global patterns that makes them so powerful for modeling all sorts of things.
It's fascinating how these, pretty abstract computational ideas manage to escape the computer science realm and actually influence other fields. The sources point to connections in architecture and urban design.
Yes, definitely. You find applications in urban models based on CA and also multi-agent systems. Jane Jacobs, for instance.
No, Jane Jacobs, yeah.
She viewed cities not as simple, solvable problems, but as problems in organized complexity, much more like biological systems.
Right, complex adaptive systems.
Precisely. And she was inspired by Warren Weaver's classification of problems, which in turn influenced thinkers like Christopher Alexander, who argued for cities growing bottom up from local interactions, kind of like a CA evolves, rather than being designed rigidly from the top down.
And we see this computational thinking applied directly by architects, too, like Mike Silver. The sources mention his work for the San Jose State University Museum of Art and Design.
Right, taking cues from how complex systems evolve based on local rules and applying that directly to design processes. It's not just architecture either. Science fiction writers pick up on this too.
Like Greg Egan's novel, Permutation City.
Exactly. It features an autoverse, which is basically a simulated artificial life universe based on a cellular automaton that's complex enough to actually model artificial chemistry.
Wow, that's a cool concept.
Isn't it? And Carl Chu's idea also mentioned about architecture being the construction of possible worlds generated by the universe of computational monads.
Computational monads.
Yeah, which he describes as self-replicating and self-organizing systems capable of forming a whole that feels directly linked back to von Neumann's foundational concepts of self-replication and CAs as these building blocks for complexity.
So it all ties together.
It really does. Now, while von Neumann's work on, say, computing architecture and self-replicating automata was massively important, he also had these incredibly prescient ideas directly related to what we now call AI and neural networks.
Right. He himself suggested remarkably early on, we're talking 40s, maybe early 50s, that you could imitate neural functions using the tech available then, like telegraph relays or vacuum tubes.
Yeah, vacuum tubes. He was thinking about the brain's mechanism computationally long before it was common.
Which predates a lot of the explicit neural network research that followed. The sources highlight some of that early stuff. McCulloch and Pitts in 43.
Yep, McCulloch and Pitts modeling neurons with electrical circuits. Then Donald Hebb in 1949 proposing the rule that neural pathways strengthen with you. Use Hebbian learning, basically.
Which is fundamental to how we think about learning, both biologically and artificially.
Absolutely. And there were early attempts to actually simulate these models, like Nathaniel Rochester's work at IBM.
And then came some really significant progress with Widrow and Hoff at Stanford in 59. They developed Adeline and Madeline.
And Madeline is actually the first neural network applied to a real-world problem. The sources say it was used for echo elimination on phone lines.
Echo elimination.
Wow.
And parts of that system are apparently still in commercial use today. That's incredible.
It really is. And they followed up in 1962 with a learning procedure. Essentially, a rule for adjusting the network's internal parameters, the weights, based on how much error it made. That's a core concept for training neural networks even now.
But despite these promising beginnings, neural network research kind of hit a wall, didn't it? Went through a significant slowdown period, the so-called AI winter for neural nets.
Yeah, it did. And the sources offer several reasons for why that happened.
Like what?
Well, early models struggled to easily extend from just single layers to more complex multi-layered networks. Sometimes the learning functions being used were flawed or limited.
Okay.
And perhaps critically, some early successes were occasionally, let's say, exaggerated,
Right.
which led to unfulfilled promises and eventually dried up funding. That happens.
Yeah, hype cycles. Plus, there were philosophical hesitations too, right? Fears about thinking machines.
Definitely. Those philosophical questions, and maybe even a bit of public fear, played a role. But another major factor, highlighted right here in the sources, was simply the sheer success and dominance of the traditional von Neumann architecture.
The sequential, stored program computer model he himself helped define.
Exactly. The very architecture he co-designed ironically overshadowed his own ideas about parallel, brain-inspired computation, at least for a time.
That's quite the historical twist, isn't it?
It is. But his forward thinking wasn't lost. Von Neumann's explicit proposal of a learning machine, a machine that could actually improve its performance over time by learning from experience, that directly inspired new waves of research later on.
And that inspiration has been enormous. I mean, it gave rise to the entire fields we know today as machine learning, artificial intelligence, modern artificial neural networks.
And even areas like genetic algorithms and evolutionary computing. A lot of it traces back.
Yeah. Indeed, the sources point to how many modern computing techniques really find their roots in these foundational ideas, which is why some call him the father of modern AI.
It's a fitting title in many ways.
And just that little detail that really puts his standing into perspective. Alan Turing, the Alan Turing,
The giant.
studied under von Neumann at Princeton. And Turing, in a letter back home, apparently mentioned von Neumann before Einstein.
Wow. That speaks volumes, doesn't it, about the regard he was held in, even then.
It really does.
So, okay, pulling these threads together,
Mm-hmm.
let's briefly circle back to the von Neumann architecture itself, the computer model. His 1945 paper on the EDVAC computer project. That laid out the blueprint, didn't it?
Yeah, the core components.
The model for the central processing unit, CPU. The crucial distinction between fast temporary memory like RAM
Right.
and long-term storage, how input and output work, and the whole concept of an instruction set.
Building on Turing's theoretical work, of course.
Of course. But this practical model became the basis for virtually every general-purpose computer built since then.
Right, so that's the physical foundation, the stage. And his work on CAs and self-replication gave us these theoretical models for digital evolution and how complex systems can emerge from simple local interactions. And his ideas on learning machines provided the conceptual blueprint for computers that can adapt and improve, which is really the heart of modern AI.
And the von Neumann architecture provides the underlying hardware platform, the engine, and the structure on which all of these complex, dynamic, and learning systems can actually be built and run today. It all connects.
It's a powerful testament, isn't it? As the sources emphasize, just incredible results possible from deeply interdisciplinary thinking and collaboration.
Absolutely.
So, wow, we've covered a lot of ground today, really diving into von Neumann's visionary work on self-replication, cellular automata, and these early ideas about learning machines, and seeing how they provided these blueprints for digital evolution, AI, and, well, computing itself.
And these aren't just, historical footnotes. The concepts we talked about continue to shape our understanding of complexity in so many different domains.
Definitely. So here's maybe a thought for you, the listener, to consider. Think about the implications of self-replicating code, or systems where incredibly complex global behaviors just arise from simple local rules, whether those systems are digital simulations, maybe biological organisms, or even cities. How does von Neumann's early work on CA and self-replication fundamentally inform our understanding of all these diverse, complex, adaptive systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe also, how does his remarkably early idea of a learning machine resonate with the explosion of AI capabilities and machine learning advancements that we're seeing happen all around us today? It feels more relevant than ever.
It really does. It's clear this is a deep well of ideas. And while we've explored some truly fundamental contributions here, von Neumann's legacy is vast and complex.
But now we dive into the contradictions, his later thinking, and how he still shapes our world.
Yeah, because he wasn't simple, was he? And the sources you've pulled together for this, his own writing, analyses of his thinking, accounts of his wartime work, they paint a really complex picture.
They do. And our goal here really is to try and, grapple with these apparent opposites. The brilliant theorist, the guy who loved games and jokes, versus the architect of war strategies.
How did those things coexist, and what does his thinking, even the really challenging parts, mean for us now with AI, global security, that kind of thing?
Exactly. It's about understanding the whole person and the enduring impact.
Okay, so let's start with that genius again, just briefly. We talked about his the bird view, right? Taking math tools from one area, topology, say, and using them in economics.
Right, that incredible ability to see connections. And then there's the depth. You mentioned Daniel Kahneman before.
Yeah, the Nobel laureate. He said von Neumann's idea of utility putting numbers on preferences was the most important theory in social science. Full stop.
Which is just immense praise, foundational, like you said.
But you also mentioned Freeman Dyson's perspective.
Dyson, being a mathematician himself, saw von Neumann more as a frog within mathematics, someone who mastered the internal landscape, the specific tools and techniques, incredibly deeply.
So both the bird and the frog, flying high across fields, but also diving deep within them.
Precisely. It speaks to this extraordinary intellectual capacity operating on multiple levels at once.
Which makes the next part maybe even harder to process.
Right.
This is the man known for being witty, sociable, loving parties, games. How does he become so central to, frankly, the machinery of war?
It's a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Seems his approach was pragmatic almost to a fault. He saw the huge existential problems and applied his intellect directly to solving them, whatever they were.
And his involvement wasn't just theoretical advice from afar.
Oh, no, not at all. Very hands-on. His calculations for the Manhattan Project, for the implosion mechanism of the atomic bomb, were Absolutely critical. They were apparently incredibly complex.
And he was in the room for discussions about target selection, too, like choosing cities in Japan.
Yes,
Yeah.
the sources confirm he was part of those high-level and obviously very grim deliberations. Kyoto was apparently on the list considered.
Wow. And the Navy worked, too, optimizing explosives.
Yeah, that's a fascinating example. He figured out the exact best depth to detonate underwater charges to maximize damage. So effective. Apparently, the Germans thought the Allies must have invented some totally new kind of explosive.
But it was just von Neumann's math.
It was the math applied with devastating precision. And then, almost immediately, he turns that same kind of thinking to the new global reality.
A Cold War.
Exactly. He took game theory, which he'd helped create, and used it to model the U.S.-Soviet rivalry. Initially, he framed it very much as a zero-sum game. One side wins, the other loses.
And that mathematical strategic view seems to have directly fueled his policy ideas, like preventative war.
Yes. It sounds shocking now, but based on his models, he argued for a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union before they could build a comparable nuclear arsenal.
There's that quote. It's pretty chilling.
The one about bombing them today versus tomorrow. If you say, why not bomb them tomorrow, I say, why not today? If you say today at 5 o'clock, I say, why not 1 o'clock?
Yeah, that one. It's pure, cold logic applied to something horrific.
He seemed to genuinely believe conflict was unavoidable, and acting first was the rational, potentially less catastrophic option in the long run. Of course, once the Soviets got the bomb, that whole logic collapsed into, well, mutually assured destruction.
But he didn't step back even then.
No, his mind stayed engaged. He worked on things like the SAGE system, that huge early warning air defense network designed to detect a Soviet bomber attack, always focused on the strategic calculus of the nuclear age.
It's just such a stark contrast. The elegant math, the economic theories, and then the calculations for atomic bombs and first strikes. But his gaze wasn't only on the immediate threats, right? He looked further ahead, too.
He absolutely did. That 1955 essay, Can We Survive Technology, is really quite remarkable.
What was he focused on there?
He was thinking about global catastrophic risks way ahead of the curve. Nuclear energy's dangers, sure, but also large-scale automation, even weather control, things that felt like science fiction then, but which he saw held potential global consequences.
And he saw technology shrinking the world.
Yeah, that was a key insight.
Yeah.
He saw technology overriding geography, making global effects possible, but our institutions, governments, societies were still stuck in geographically defined boxes. That created a dangerous mismatch.
He saw the power, saw the risks, but what about the solutions?
That's where it gets interesting and maybe a bit bleak. He identified these huge systemic risks, but his conclusion wasn't some grand plan. It was more like, we just have to muddle through. He talked about needing day-to-day, opportunistic measures, a long sequence of small, correct decisions. It sounds quite fatalistic, or maybe just deeply realistic about the complexity, not exactly a call for bold, proactive governance.
Almost like constant crisis management is the best we can hope for. The sources also mention a shift in his thinking about computation itself, towards being a natural philosopher of it.
Right. Later in his life, perhaps influenced by physicists he knew, like Pauli and Heisenberg, he seemed to move beyond just the pure logic, the abstract math of computation.
How so?
He started thinking about computation in terms of its physical reality, the energy it uses, how information actually gets processed in a physical system. He even questioned if simple formal logic could really explain something as complex as, say, the brain.
It sounds very relevant to AI research today.
It does, yeah. He was wondering if the sheer scale of complexity changes the rules, in a way, anticipating some of the deep questions we're still grappling with in AI.
And that incredible story about cellular automata, predicting DNA replication.
Oh, that's just mind-blowing, isn't it? Working with these simple grid-based theoretical models, he basically deduced the logic of how a complex biological molecule must be able to copy itself years before Watson and Crick figured out the actual structure of DNA.
It's that pattern-seeing ability again, connecting computation theory to fundamental biology.
Just seeing the underlying principles, whether it was markets, war, computers, or life itself. It's quite something.
So hearing from people who knew him, we mentioned Dyson and Kahneman. What else?
Well, the sources do mention, alongside the awe for his intellect, that some colleagues found some of his, let's say, personal habits a bit disconcerting. Just a reminder he was human, complex.
And there's the question of the personal cost, living at that intensity involved in things like atomic testing.
There's the suggestion, that his bone cancer might have been linked to radiation exposure from tests he witnessed. We can't know for sure, of course.
But he kept working, even when he was seriously ill.
Right up until near the end, holding meetings with top officials from his hospital bed at Walter Reed. The drive to engage with these huge problems just didn't stop.
And then the sad story about his wife, Clara.
Yes, the sources note she died by suicide several years after his death.
Yeah.
They don't speculate on the reasons, but... well, you can only imagine the pressures of living alongside that kind of relentless intensity focused on such high-stakes global issues. It has a tragic dimension.
It really does. And it makes you think about that point raised in the sources. Could a mind like von Neumann's even operate the same way today?
With the way research is structured now, so much specialization, bureaucracy, it might be harder for someone to make those broad, boundary-crossing leaps he was famous for. The system might not support it in the same way.
So wrapping this part of the deep dive up, what's the takeaway on von Neumann, this incredibly complex figure?
Well, clearly, a genius whose work is baked into the foundations of our modern world. Computing, economics, game theory, nuclear strategy. His fingerprints are everywhere.
But also a figure of profound contradictions. The playful intellectual who designed weapons of mass destruction. The visionary who saw global risks but maybe offered only reactive solutions.
Yeah, his legacy is completely tangled up with both creation and destruction. He gave us tools to understand complexity, make decisions, build computers.
And also tools to model global conflict, to rationalize the arms race, to quantify the unthinkable.
Exactly. So maybe the thought to leave you with is about that paradox. What happens when one brilliant mind creates tools that can be used for such utterly opposing ends? Building knowledge and enabling conflict. And what's the real cost for the individual, for society, of wielding that kind of intellectual power?
Okay, so as we start to wrap up this deep dive on John von Neumann, gosh, pulling from all these sources, what really hits you is just the breadth of it all.
Yeah, the scale.
Yeah.
It's immense.
His mind just seemed to reach into, well, almost everything, didn't it? Physics, math, economics.
Computing, obviously. Foundational stuff there.
Right, computing, and even theoretical biology. It's kind of staggering.
Absolutely. You look back at the 20th century and, well, so much of what shaped it, technically, conceptually, von Neumann's fingerprints are all over it.
He wasn't just adding bits and pieces, was he?
No, not at all. He was often laying down the whole framework, the things everyone else built on for, well, decades.
But the sources are really clear on this too. That incredible brain power, it was also turned towards creating some truly powerful and, let's be honest, terrifying tools. The Manhattan Project work is, well, it's a huge part of his story.
It is a very significant part. He was right in the thick of it, providing absolutely crucial math.
The sources mention his specific idea for implosion, for the Fat Man bomb.
Exactly. And his calculations, incredibly precise for the blast radius and effects. I mean, this was raw genius applied directly to weapon design on a scale nobody had seen before.
And that just throws up all these difficult questions, doesn't it? The ones the sources really wrestle with.
Yeah.
How do you square that kind of brilliance with, helping create weapons used on civilians?
It's tough. And the sources also bring up his later, very strong anti-communist stance, his advocacy for preemptive strikes against the Soviets. It adds layers, definitely.
Makes it even more complex to grapple with his legacy.
It does. Though, some sources also raise the counterpoint, this idea that maybe the very horror of these weapons, coupled with things like mutually assured destruction.
Which his work, game theory, helped explain, right?
Precisely. That maybe that sheer destructive potential actually, paradoxically, prevented even bigger conflicts between the major powers, made the cost just unthinkable. It's a heavy legacy to weigh.
So moving from, the immense power of the atom, which needed all that calculation, his thinking also laid down the tracks for our digital world.
Oh, absolutely. He took Alan Turing's theoretical concept, the universal computation idea.
And he sort of pushed it towards reality.
Yes, exactly. Towards actual physical machines. And one of the most, mind-bending ideas from the sources is his universal constructor.
Right, this theoretical machine. Tell us a bit about that again.
Well, imagine a machine that could not just do things, but could actually build other machines and, crucially, replicate itself.
Wow.
He described what it would need: A blueprint, like instructions, some kind of constructor arm to build using the blueprint,
Yeah.
a copier to duplicate the blueprint itself,
Okay.
and fascinatingly, the possibility for small errors, mutations during the copying process.
And the truly wild thing, which the sources highlight, is how this completely abstract 1940s idea, it basically predicted stuff we later found in biology.
It's an uncanny parallel, isn't it? The blueprint, well, that looks a lot like DNA.
Genetic code.
Right, the constructor arm. That sounds like the ribosome, the cell's protein factory reading the DNA instructions.
Uh-huh.
The copier,
Uh-huh.
like the enzymes, DNA polymerase that replicate our genes.
Mm-hmm.
And mutation. That's literally the engine of evolution errors in DNA copying.
So his abstract computing concept mirrored life's core processes, the central dogma of molecular biology, basically.
Pretty much. The flow of information from DNA to RNA to protein. It's an astonishing foresight.
It really forces you to see life differently, doesn't it, as information processing.
Exactly. And that insight led him and others inspired by him to view biological molecules, cells, maybe even whole organisms as incredibly complex computing devices.
Not just wet chemistry, but machines running on logical rules.
Precisely. Operating according to rules you could, in theory, describe mathematically, like finite state machines or maybe more complex automata. Think about how a cell decides things. It's processing signals, following internal logic.
So maybe, as the sources suggest, biology and computer science, they're not so separate after all.
Maybe they're ultimately studying the same fundamental thing. Complex systems governed by logical rules, whether they're built from silicon or carbon. It's a pretty profound thought.
And we definitely can't finish without circling back to game theory, another huge one.
Oh, absolutely monumental. Started with poker, analyzing simple games.
But it just exploded outwards, didn't it?
Completely. Military strategy, Rander Corporation stuff, the sources mentioned, economic modeling, understanding social interactions. Its reach is just vast.
And one source made a point that really stuck with me, how game theory could even give a sort of scientific basis to concepts we think of as purely moral.
Yes, that's fascinating. Things like justice or even forgiveness.
How does that work?
Well, in simulations of repeated interactions, like do you cooperate or betray someone you keep meeting?
Yeah.
Certain strategies just work better long term. Tit for tat is the classic.
Cooperate first, then copy whatever they did last time.
Basically, yeah. Simple reciprocity. It shows that a kind of fairness or justice is actually a really effective strategy for stability and mutual benefit.
And what about the generous strategies?
Right. Sometimes being willing to forgive an occasional betrayal and try cooperating again actually works better than getting locked into endless revenge cycles.
So the cold math suggests.
It suggests that things like basic fairness and the ability to forgive aren't just, nice ideals. They might actually be mathematically advantageous, even essential for the long-term survival and health of any group or system that involves interacting agents.
Wow. So you put it all together. Harnessing the atom, decoding life's logic, mapping human strategy. John von Neumann's impact on the 20th century is just profound.
It truly is. And you see the echoes everywhere today, don't you? AI, biotechnology, how we manage global cooperation and conflict.
We're still grappling with the implications of the paths he helped forge.
Absolutely. The questions he was asking, the tools he was building, they're still shaping the challenges and the possibilities of this century.
Well, this has been an incredible journey through the sources on John von Neumann. Really fascinating stuff. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did.
And we hope you'll join us again for future deep dives as we tackle more complex topics.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe leave you with a final thought to chew on, drawn from the discussions in the sources. Perhaps it's that question. Is genius truly orthogonal to ethics? Can they exist on completely separate planes?
Or maybe the idea that, even though we feel like we're drowning in data these days,
We're still thirsty for real knowledge, for understanding the fundamental rules, the computations driving everything around us.
or that final insight from game theory, that maybe things like justice and forgiveness aren't just moral luxuries, but potentially fundamental requirements for any kind of lasting success or survival. Something to think about.